Hi, my name is Michal. This is episode 4 of the Homebound series, where we discuss the Torah, Hashkafa, and spiritual aspects of living in Eretz Yisrael. In the last 2 episodes, we discussed just the tip of the iceberg of how big of a mitzvah it is to live in Eretz Yisrael and what it does for one's spirituality. But today, I'd like to discuss Eretz Yisrael from a different angle. See, there are many Jews who understand that we need to live in Eretz Yisrael, but wonder, are we forcing our way before the proper time? If Mashiach is going to bring us to Eretz Yisrael anyway, then why can't I just wait? And if now is really the time to move to Eretz Yisrael, shouldn't there be some signs, some open miracles? So today I'd like to talk about what happens before the coming of Mashiach, and what we need to do in preparation for his arrival. Now what I'm referring to specifically is Kibbutz Goliath, which in simple English means that Klal Yisroel needs to be in Eretz Yisrael before Mashiach can arrive. And as it's written all throughout Tanakh, that Hashem will perform miraculous signs to let us know that the time for Mashiach's arrival is approaching. Now the miracles that will take place before Mashiach's arrival are clearly written all throughout Tanakh and the Talmud. And it also states in many places that the process of Mashiach's arrival will happen at first very slowly, and as it gets closer to the appointed time, the miracles and signs will start happening at a faster pace and become more and more clear. And as it states in Talmud Yerushalmi Masechtas Brachos, Reb Chia and Rav Shimon ben Chalafta were walking, and they saw the rays of the sun rising. So Rav Chia said, this is how the redemption of Klal Yisroel will take place. At first, little by little, but as it progresses, it grows greater and greater. Now I'd like to present to you the most agreed upon events and the most mainstream views brought down by Tanakh, the Talmud, and all of Chazal as to what will take place before the coming of Mashiach. Number 1 is the land, Eretz Yisrael, will start bearing produce and become fruitful, which hasn't happened in nearly 2,000 years. As Rabbeinu Bachya states, it is a great sign for the Jewish people that no other nation has ever been able to settle in the land, and it will remain desolate until its children, Klal Yisroel, return to Eretz Yisrael. Number 2 is a series of wars in which many nations will join together and attack Klal Yisroel, but miraculously, we will win through the great hand of Hashem. These wars are talked about all throughout the Nevi'im, and particularly in Sefer Yecheskel, in Perek Lamed Ches and Lamed Tes. And number 3 is Kibbutz Goliath, the return of Klal Yisroel to Eretz Yisrael, in which we will regain control of Eretz Yisrael with the consent of the nations of the world, as the Ramban and the Radak clearly state that we will take back Eretz Yisrael with the permission of the kings of the world. Now, if one truly understands what has taken place in the last 150 years of Jewish history, it would be clear to anyone that it is absolutely time for all of us to move back to Eretz Yisrael. But because not everybody has the time to learn about Jewish history, let me give you a quick breakdown as to what's been taking place over the last 150 years. It started about 2,600 years ago with the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, where, because of our many sins, Hashem took back the greatest gift he ever gave to us, Eretz Yisrael, and he threw us out. But sadly, in that short 70-year period, Klal Yisroel got so caught up with their new comfortable lifestyle that even with Ezra and Nehemiah as their leaders, they refused to return back to Eretz Yisrael. And out of the millions of Jews, only 42,000 of them, of which were the poor and the lower class, followed Ezra and Nehemiah to Eretz Yisrael, while the wise and the rich, too caught up in their upper class lifestyles, refused to follow. Because of this terrible insult to Hashem, and their refusal to accept Hashem's invitation to come back to Eretz Yisrael, Hashem never rested his Shekhinah on the second Beis HaMikdash the way he did on the first. And this redemption was doomed for failure from the outset, because the Jews didn't care enough to come back home. And so it was about 2,000 years ago we were exiled, yet again, for the long and bitter gullus that we're still in. And as God promised, for 2,000 years, we've been dispersed throughout the world, beaten and broken, murdered and exiled by every single country that we've tried to settle in. Because Hashem never wants us to forget that Klal Yisroel only has one home, in Eretz Yisrael. And alongside our exile, Hashem kept his promise that Eretz Yisrael lay desolate, never bearing fruit, and never allowing any other nation to inhabit it. And so it was for nearly 2,000 years. Eretz Yisrael remained faithful, longing for the return of her people, for Klal Yisroel to come back home to Eretz Yisrael. But then something happened. In the early 1800s, the Vilna Gaon set out for Eretz Yisrael, but for reasons never revealed to us, he never made it to Eretz Yisrael. But it seemed he had a mission to carry out. So he sent 500 of his Talmidim on the dangerous journey to travel to Eretz Yisrael to begin the resettling of the land. His mission became quite successful, and shortly after, many Jews followed. And by the late 1800s, thousands of Jews were on their way to Eretz Yisrael. And when witnessing this miraculous event, the Chafetz Chaim wrote to his son that it seems clear that Hashem remembered his people, and it's possible that the Kibbutz Goliath, the gathering of the Jews back to Eretz Yisrael, has started. The Chafetz Chaim also wrote that anyone who can should buy land and move to Eretz Yisrael. The Chafetz Chaim himself purchased land in Eretz Yisrael and bought tickets. He attempted to move, but unfortunately never made it here. Now the Chafetz Chaim wrote all this when there was less than 100,000 Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. Imagine what he would have said today, when there are millions. And so it happened. As the Jews started moving back to Eretz Yisrael, Hashem kept his promise. And the land, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, became fruitful yet again. What was an uninhabitable desert for 2,000 years is now a blossoming fertile land, which not only produces enough food for itself, but even exports and sells fruit and vegetables to other countries. As Rav Abba states in Masechtas Sanhedrin, that there's no clearer sign than the coming of Mashiach than when Eretz Yisrael once again starts bearing fruit and vegetation. But at this point in time, we were living in Eretz Yisrael, which was still under British control. And as we stated earlier, that one of the miraculous events that will take place before the coming of Mashiach will be our regaining control of Eretz Yisrael with the permission of the nations of the world. But this was an impossible task. After all, the Jews were hated and despised by every single nation in the world. But Hashem can bring forth light, even from the darkest of places. See, after the horrific events of the Holocaust, while every Jew was engulfed in darkness and pain, Hashem was busy planting the seeds of our final redemption. See, the nations of the world, for just a moment, felt so bad for Klal Yisroel that the anti-Semitic United Nations, in one of the only pro-Jewish decisions they ever made, voted to split Eretz Yisrael between the Jews and the Arabs. And the Jews were given Eretz Yisrael with the consent of the nations of the world, fulfilling yet another impossible piece of the prophetic events leading up to the coming of Mashiach. And now, it was time for Hashem to show Klal Yisroel his mighty hand, and that it was he alone who was guiding us to our destiny. See, the very next day, after Israel declared its independence, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and Arabs from Sudan and the Palestinians all joined together and declared war on Israel. To put this in perspective, that's about 600,000 Holocaust-surviving Jews with barely any working weapons against 45 million Arabs. But we won, because we didn't fight the war. Hashem did. And then again in 1967, the Six-Day War broke out. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan attacked Israel on 3 fronts. The Jews in Eretz Yisrael were so sure of their coming defeat that they started preparing large plots of land as graveyards so they'd have place to bury all the dead. But yet again, we won. And it goes down as one of the most miraculous victories ever won in military history, thus fulfilling the prophecies of the many nations that will wage war against us, and our continued victories in which it is clear that Hashem is fighting the battles for us and directing us towards our ultimate destiny. Now, one who sees all these miraculous events unfold but chooses to ignore them because he's waiting for the Beis HaMikdash to float down from heaven and for Mashiach to magically fly everyone over to Eretz Yisrael on giant eagles. The Rambam has already stated in his Hilchas Malachim, Perek Yud Aleph and Yud Beis, that anyone who thinks that Mashiach will perform miraculous events or that the world will change its course as we already know it, such a person is considered a fool. As the Chachamim in Masechtas Brachos state, that there's no difference between the world that we live in now and the days after Mashiach, other than our freedom from the nations of the world. See, when Hashem appeared to Moshe Rabbeinu in the burning bush, the pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu thought to himself, why is this bush on fire, yet not being burnt? Then the next pasuk says that Hashem saw that Moshe Rabbeinu turned towards the bush and wondered why it wasn't being burnt up. Now, why did the Torah need to tell us all this? Why was all this information needed? It's because even when Hashem performs miracles, few people turn to take notice and wonder, what is the message within the signs? And this contemplation by Moshe Rabbeinu as to why the bush wasn't being burnt up is actually a very rare character trait, and is what set Moshe Rabbeinu apart from the rest. Now, in recent years, Hashem has been performing miracles equally as great as Kriyas Yamsuf, but millions of Jews choose to ignore the messages that Hashem is trying to tell us, so that they don't have to leave their comforts in Chutz La'aretz and actually do what Hashem is clearly telling us to. And if you think that Kriyas Yamsuf and the 10 Makos are much clearer miracles than what we're experiencing right now, then why is it written in Parshas Beshalach that all throughout the night Hashem made a wind blow, and only by the morning did the ocean become a dry piece of land? If Hashem wanted the clearest miracle possible, why is it that he needed a wind, and why did it take the entire night till the sea dried up? It's because every time Hashem performs a miracle, Hashem always infuses it with just a little bit of nature, so that we can have free will and decide for ourselves if we're willing to see the miracles, if we're willing to see the signs that Hashem is sending us, or if we will choose to attribute it to coincidence and nature. After all, Chazal tell us that 4/5 of Klal Yisroel were killed out in Makas Choshech. That's 80% of Klal Yisroel chose to ignore Hashem's signs and stay in Mitzrayim. Now, are we going to learn from their mistakes? Are we going to learn from the mistakes of the Meraglim? Are we going to learn from the mistakes of the Jews in Bavel? As Albert Einstein famously quoted, the definition of insanity is somebody who attempts to do the same thing over and over and expects different results. And if Hashem is going to magically float us all over to Eretz Yisrael, then why is it necessary for there to be hundreds of psukim in Tanakh telling us what to expect before the coming of Mashiach? What does it matter? Well, I'll tell you. It only matters if there's something we're supposed to learn from it. If there's something that we're supposed to do about it. See, when Klal Yisroel was standing at the edge of the Yamsuf, and the Mitzrayim were armed and gathered together, ready to attack, Klal Yisroel turned up to heaven and cried out to Hashem. But Hashem responded, now is not the time for prayer. Now is the time for action. Now is the time to go. We've been crying out to Hashem for 2,000 years now. Shachris, Mincha, Mariv, benching. There isn't a page in the Siddur that doesn't make mention of how much we want to return to Eretz Yisrael. But if Hashem has brought to reality almost every single miracle that He promised would happen before the coming of Mashiach, now is not the time to calculate. Now is not the time to pray. Now is the time to go. It's time to come back to Eretz Yisrael for once and for all. And if we're not willing to come back to Eretz Yisrael, then what exactly are we praying for? To properly explain this, we have a famous mashal. There was a giant tidal wave that flooded a city, and there was a man stranded. So he climbed up to the roof of his house, and he cried out to Hashem to please perform a miracle and save him so that he wouldn't have to drown. A minute later, a rescue boat pulled up, and they yelled out to jump in. But he said, no thanks. I'm praying to God, and I'm waiting for Him to save me through a miracle. And so a few moments later, a helicopter flew by and let down a rope, and they said, climb on up. And he said, no thanks. I'm crying out to Hashem, and I'm waiting for Him to save me with a miracle. And then the water rose up above the house, and the man drowned. He went up to heaven, and he came before God. And he said, I cried out to you. I trusted in you. I asked you to save me. Why didn't you? So of course God responded, you fool. I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter. All you needed to do was jump in. But you refused to do your part and to allow me to save you. So to my dear brothers and sisters in Chutz La'aretz, never in history has there been a time when it was so easy to move to Eretz Yisrael. It's one short plane ride away. Eretz Yisrael has been built up, fully established, and ready for you to come. Klal Yisroel has been waiting for this opportunity for thousands of years. Are we going to let this pass? It's time to come back home and stop repeating the mistakes of our ancestors. So thanks for watching this episode of Homebound. And of course, thank you Hashem for allowing us to return back to your home, to Eretz Yisrael.